for dark nights.
Mr. Patches by Konstantine Paradias, narrated by David Lewis Richardson, with Heather Ordover. My grandma gave me Mr. Patches when I was just 4 years old and still afraid of the dark.
Just hold it close when the lights go out, and make sure you don't let go,
She whispered in my ear as she handed me the disheveled teddy bear. Mr. Patches was a veteran of 2 world wars, and it showed. He had a single glass button for an eye and a square of silk fabric on his belly. He had plaid armpits, and the ends of his feet were clad in felt. His smile was crooked. The black thread that originally outlined his mouth, long since torn, had been replaced halfway through by bright blue strands. It made his mouth look funny, like he was smiling 2 different kinds of smiles.
One
My grandma said, pointing at the black thread half.
is for children that have good dreams. The other
She turned Mr. Patches, showing the mad zigzag of blue.
is for boogeymen, which Mr. Patches eats.
Following her instructions to the letter, I did sleep with Mr. Patches, holding him close and never once letting him out of my arms as I slept. And, true to her promise, Mr. Patches dispelled my fear of the dark and swept away the bogeymen, keeping fiercely at my side. By the time I was 6, I had known little else but peace and his comforting presence. The bogeymen came back in full force on my 7th birthday, when I had thought myself too old to need Mr. Patches' help. It started as whispers beneath my bed and tiny sounds from the creaking house as it settled. It grew into long shadows and the headlights of passing cars, throwing odd shapes on the faces of action figures and posters, altering their features subtly, sinisterly. It progressed within a week, into moaning from behind the wall and tearing sounds coming from somewhere inside the ceiling. Mr. Patches was lying on my bed beside me, not in my arms, when I opened my eyes and searched for him. Tiny bits of thread hung loosely from the silk square on his belly, the cotton stuffing slightly gutted and oozing through. I couldn't put down exactly how I had known, but his glass eye was transfixed on my bedroom wall, at the tiny crack, indistinguishable from the rest of the wall in the darkness. I couldn't exactly see it, but I could make out what looked like a tiny bit of thread that had been somehow sewn into the plaster, holding it together. I daren't tell my parents for fear of being scolded, and I couldn't call my grandmother for fear of her not believing me, or of hurting her feelings when she'd see the tear on Mr. Patches, thinking it had been the result of my clumsiness. For a month, I slept fitfully, fearing the sounds in the darkness, but keeping Mr. Patches by my side, his threading growing all the more ragged, the felt on his right foot fraying. The crack on the wall had expanded, but was now clearly held in place by bright-coloured thread. Even so, from the tiny opening, I could clearly hear the sound of something shuffling uneasily, its breathing strained with anticipation. When I awoke on midnight to find the plaid armpit patches torn from out, their tiny squares sewn into the part of the wall where the crack had widened the most, I finally mustered the strength to tiptoe out of my room and into the living room to call Grandma. I knew that she would probably be asleep at that hour, but I daren't face my parents the next day or attempt to withstand another night of the strange whispers. Halfway through dialing her number, there was a roar and a sound like something tearing. Not fabric or felt, but some impossibly powerful burst of air bent on tearing doors from hinges, limbs from bodies. Something screamed upstairs, another thing cackled, I heard threads popping, and something that might have been a bag full of sand slamming against the floorboards. When my parents rushed into my room, they found me there, clutching at the ravaged Mr. Patches, my tiny hand struggling to stuff the cotton back inside the fabric. His glass eye had gone, his padding too, so the fur hung limply. The crack on the plaster was no longer there, and then I knew Mr. Patches was gone too. I gave him a proper funeral, the kind that storybooks said was reserved for soldiers. My grandma was there to attend as soon as I told her the news. We bundled the skin of Mr. Patches carefully inside my favourite cartoon bedsheets and lowered him into the grave set in the garden. My grandma died too, the following day, of a stroke, her eyes transfixed on the wall of her bedroom, where I saw a tiny, almost indistinguishable crack. I grew up since then, learned to overcome my fears on my own. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the sounds that the house makes and the whispers slide out from beneath the floorboards. There's a crack on my wall, a new one, in a new home, faintly outlined against the plaster that I cannot plug, cannot stitch together by myself, no matter how hard I might try. Sometimes something snarls at me from the tiny slit and I find myself, a grown man, praying I still had Mr. Patches.